Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
But we begin in Northern Ireland. The first time that we talked about it, it was quite an odd experience, wasn't it? It was, I mean, revelatory in many ways, but also slightly embarrassing to realise how little we knew about how issues in Northern Ireland were impacting upon the population. I don't just mean Brexit, actually. I mean the way that we looked at everything from abortion law right through to the referendum. Since the Troubles, it felt to me as if Northern Ireland had been almost squeezed out of national media coverage. Now, I know outside the London bubble, many people feel a little bit ignored, I think with justification, actually, but few can feel quite as ignored. Few British people can feel quite as ignored as the people of Northern Ireland. And the more we thought about it and the more we talked about it, the more, I don't know what word to use, actually, because it doesn't spook me in one sense. I have a kind of lazy, romantic idea that the island of Ireland should be united, but I'm certainly, it's not a bridge I'm going to fight on in the context of the population of Northern Ireland still mostly wanting to remain part of the United Kingdom. But I just found myself really struggling to see how the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland could survive Brexit once those red lines were established. I do sort of find myself returning to territory that we've been over a few times in the past, although oddly not recently, hardly at all this year, you know, this stuff, and it's July already. But once those red lines were introduced by Theresa May, you remember, the customs union and single market, and phrases like regulatory alignment when applied to the Good Friday Agreement, phrases that essentially encompass the spirit and the meaning of that treaty, a peace treaty, but also, of course, a treaty that governs so many different areas of life. Best summed up as saying you can't have different environments on the same island. That would be, I think, the neatest or the pithiest way of summing it up. If you've got a better way, then you know how today's first hour is going to work. It is an invitation to people who have a better understanding or knowledge of matters Irish than I do, which is pretty much everybody who lives there, and plenty of people who don't. 0345 606 0973 is the number you need. But the way I understand it is you can't have major differences in anything, actually, on two sides of a border, whether it's visible or invisible. You can't have different regulations governing hygiene. You can't have different rules in place governing some matters of law and order even, but mostly trade, mostly selling. You can't, for example, sell in Northern Ireland at a different price from what is... You can't provide an advantage, that's the better word. You can't provide an advantage to people on either side of what used to be the hard border. So that is a fundamental tenet of the Good Friday Agreement, equality of both parts of Ireland. So when I looked at it, I found myself thinking two things. The first was, how can you possibly keep that parity in place if we're not in the customs union and the single market, unless we agree to abide by pretty much all of the rules of the customs union and the single market? And of course, as soon as you suggest, I hope I've got all of this right, but crack on if you think I haven't. As soon as you suggest that we should stay, that we have to stay in the customs union and the single market in order to sustain the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement, then that for me was the first moment where I found myself thinking, I don't see how this can end without either no deal or no Brexit. Because there is no deal that would allow us to retain membership of the customs union and the single market after Theresa May laid down her red lines. Even Liam Fox now is conceding publicly that there's no way to have frictionless trade in the European Union, between us and the European Union, without membership of the single market. So it just began, and one of the great problems, this is why I'm so grateful to you for your kindness when we bump into each other out and about, or when you drop me notes or turn up for my book signings and what have you. Because some mornings, I'm not going to lie to you, I sit here and I try and work stuff out, and I can't quite work out why no one else is trying to work this stuff out. It shouldn't really have come as a surprise to anybody, what has happened in Ireland with regard to Brexit. Because once you understand that things have to be the same on both sides of what used to be the border, and on our side, there's a determination, or there was a determination in Downing Street to leave the customs union and the single market, and on the other side, there is continuing membership of the customs union and the single market, then we cannot sustain the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement without sustaining the terms of membership of the customs union and the single market in Northern Ireland. And again, it's not a failure of politics for me, this. It's a failure of journalism. Because, very simply, what seems to have happened is a combination, a very Brexity combination of delusion and denial, whereby people insisted that they would be able to come up with a system that somehow managed to ensure that a territory outside the customs union and the single market and a territory inside the customs union and the single market was somehow abiding by the same rules without having hard checks at the border. And we sat here, didn't we? And I mean, today really, 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 really is one of these issues where I wish now we could all just agree that we're on the same page, because the point at which it all began to fall apart was surely the point at which you just realised the people saying that they could fix the problem were the same people objecting to the backstop, which exists only until the problem is fixed. That's an almost philosophical conundrum there. I think that's a fair comment. The same people that said this is easy to fix were the people who have actually, the ERG essentially are the ones that have stopped Brexit from happening because they refused to accept a backstop which would have remained in place until the thing they said was easy to fix got fixed. I think we've been dancing around that maypole now for the best part of 3 years, but specifically about 18 months. So my question this morning, and my listeners in Ireland and Northern Ireland are particularly welcome to ring in today, but obviously anybody is also to accept this invitation. I don't see how it can survive. If we crack on with no deal, which I think now most of us would agree is looking very, very hard to avoid, I certainly don't think it's certain, but I can't see any deal emerging between now and, in Jeremy Hunt's case, the end of September. In Boris Johnson's case, presumably the end of October. It's just not going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, and whoever ends up in Downing Street insists upon pursuing the departure from the single market and the customs union, then I don't think Northern Ireland will be part of the United Kingdom for much longer. Discuss. 0345 6060 973. James, you're already talking rubbish. Mate, you've spelt "you're" wrong, but I'll read your text out nonetheless. There's different fuel prices, that would be there are. Different fuel prices on either side of the border, and VAT rates and corporate tax rates, yes, but those are things that you're allowed to diverge on under customs union and single market membership, mate. So we're talking about the things you're not allowed to diverge on under customs union and single market membership. If you read the Good Friday Agreement, it actually specifies that it is an agreement between two European Union members. So there's no accommodation or prospect in there of this treaty sustaining when only one of the signatories is a European Union member. I mean, it really is. It's the reason why perhaps I'm not sounding as fluent as I usually do, because it's so complicated and confusing, and yet at the same time so simple. So I'm trying to cut through the confusion and the complication and hit the simplicity. But the bottom line is, as soon as Theresa May, and she understood this is the bit I will never get my head around. She was one of the only politicians in the United Kingdom before the referendum to explain the threat to the Good Friday Agreement, the threat to the island of Ireland. As soon as she made customs union and single market withdrawal red lines, I think it became inevitable that Northern Ireland would cease to be part of the United Kingdom in our lifetime. Hopefully, you've got something to challenge that analysis or to add to that analysis. Let's find out. Phone lines are wide open. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. Can the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland survive a no-deal Brexit? OK? Yes or no? And if you're going to say yes, then, how can I put this modestly, then you must know more about this than I do, because I can't currently see how that could possibly happen. All right? 0345 6060 973. Do you know, when I was a kid, it was a massive story. It was a massive issue of our time, but obviously largely because of the Troubles, because of the terror attacks, the terrorism undertaken by sectarians on both sides of the Northern Irish conflict, but also as someone with an apostrophe in his name, but who didn't set foot in Ireland as a child. It always felt unfair somehow that Northern Ireland, well, you know, that Ireland wasn't united and independent. As I've got older and I've learnt more about the history, I realised perhaps how dangerous it is to have a simplistic and/or romantic approach to this issue. But for the first time in my life, contemplating Brexit and understanding what I do, I can't see how the current arrangements can be sustained if we end up with no deal, which both contenders for the leadership are in Northern Ireland today essentially championing. What do you think? 0345 6060 973. Cheryl's in Glasgow. Cheryl, what do you reckon?
Hi, James. I'm a first-time caller.
You're very
Quite
welcome.
a new listener to your show as well, but I really enjoy it.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll soon change that.
Well, you're hilarious. I love all the Boris Johnson and Esther McVeigh soundbites.
Go on, what do you think about this suggestion that...
I just think that Scotland and Northern Ireland trade a lot of very similar products, and if there's we're all so close as well by each other, obviously. So what's going to happen to Scotland if Northern Ireland have got a different trade deal from us? Are we going to be left out again? Obviously, if the trade deals that are better in Ireland, people will go there for the stuff that they could be getting from Scotland. So I think definitely it'll be an end to the union if...
Well, I don't know. I mean, the Scotland issue is interesting, but I don't know that it's immediately relevant to what we're discussing today. If you have... I mean, it's more a question of if we're not in the single market and the customs union, then either Northern Ireland stays in it on its own, de facto...
Which would be a problem for Scotland, because obviously they would have different trade conditions from us. Yes.
Yes, of course. And that is why the backstop has been extended to the whole of the United Kingdom, so that you don't have that disparity, but they don't want it extended to the whole of the United Kingdom, because that confines these whatever it is they want, and we still don't, and they still don't know. Gosh.
I think that Brexit's been a farce from start to finish, and I don't really feel like I've got much of a say or a fight in it, because I didn't vote, because I didn't know enough about the European Union at the time.
Nobody
and I would
did.
not want to make an informed vote.
It didn't stop anyone else on either side. It didn't stop 30-odd million people for... I didn't know enough about the European Union to I should never have been allowed to vote in there. I'd take it now.
Nobody should have, and I know that everybody says that the 17.2 million, or however many it was all about... We all knew about Europe. We all knew what we were voting for. Nobody had a clue what they were voting for.
No,
People voted for a red bus. They voted for a red bus, and they voted for the Brexit propaganda of sandy-coloured people taking over the nation, Turkey, all that. It was a complete farce from beginning till now.
Well, you should have flipping voted, Cheryl.
But I didn't know at the time.
No, well, nor did I, and that's why I can't really do any telling off except with my tongue in my cheek. So how does it survive if the United Kingdom is not abiding by the rules of single market and customs union membership, and the Republic of Ireland continues to do so? How does it survive without either a proper hard border on the island of Ireland, or it needs consent under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. They put it to the people, and if you get a majority on both sides, in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, you have, that's it, a reunification. That's in the text. What is the third alternative? The way that you can somehow keep the same environment on both sides of what used to be a hard border, but not keep them at the same time. That's why I get so confused, because I don't know why people who are well paid, presumably well qualified, certainly prominent, they stand up in public and say things, but when you really, really, really boil it down, it is saying you have to have checks, but you can't have checks. And then they say it's really easy to solve. They're technological solutions. That's possible, but they don't currently exist, which is why the backstop can't have a time limit on it, because the backstop stays in place until the solution exists. And as soon as it exists, you introduce it, and the backstop disappears. And then you have two different environments separated by an invisible border where there are no checks, but somehow with a guarantee that you can't get stuff that obeys one set of rules into an area where a different set of rules apply, which you would then be breaking. That's it. That's the simplest way of putting it. Here is a thing, right? While it's in Northern Ireland, it's obeying the rules. If it moves into the Republic of Ireland, it's breaking the rules. How do you ensure, without checks at the border, that it can't get from A to B? It's that simple, I think. Mark's in Peterborough. Mark, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say, James, you're coming at this from a totally wrong angle. You're coming from it with figures, business, money, that you're coming from that angle, right?
And you're going to come at it from the feelings angle?
No. Okay. I'm not coming from it from a feelings angle. So I'm coming from a people's angle.
Yes, but what's the
right?
opposite of facts?
The people, right?
Yes.
In Northern Ireland, right? I'll give you a simplification. A nationalist Republican in Belfast, right?
Yes.
Has more in common with a loyalist unionist in Belfast than he has from anybody in Dublin.
I wasn't a pejorative when I said feelings. I didn't mean it as a criticism. Yes, so they feel the same. You're telling me that they feel... Stop talking for a minute. You're telling me that they feel the same. I agree with you. That's why I said feelings.
No, they don't. They have the same outlook. It's not feelings.
What is it then?
The same outlook. And the outlook is that we came through a 30-year conflict, right?
Yes.
And the thing was that the work that was put into that, resolution of that,
yes,
has nothing. The only thing that I come from near the border, right?
Yes.
I'm a unionist that comes from near the border. I had 22 members of my family and my friends murdered in that conflict, right?
Yes.
I can tell you something now. That was a hard-won peace, right? And if the European Union insists on gathering its tariffs to compromise that peace, then the problem lies with the European Union, not with the people of Northern Ireland, of whatever persuasion they come from.
Right. I think I understand what you're saying. My apologies in advance if I don't. But you can't just say you're talking about laws, James, as if I shouldn't be. I mean, this is what it is all about. It's about rules and laws that apply currently equally in Northern Ireland and Ireland. We have decided, the British people have decided that we want to have different rules and laws now. We don't want to be in the customs union or the single market. Mm-hmm. And the Good Friday Agreement stipulates or certainly rests upon the insistence that you have to have the same laws applying across the whole island. So just unravel that for me.
Rules and laws are made by men and women, right? Right? They're not set in stone and concrete. They can be flexible.
Well, the Good Friday Agreement
is. They can be changed. They can be moved. The Good Friday says, the fundamental part of the Good Friday, which I studied, supported and signed on behalf of the loyalist paramilitaries, right? The Good Friday states that it's consent. Everything's by consent. So it's no matter what the European Union states in its laws. It's about the consent of the people of Ireland.
No. The consent clause is about what would happen in the event of a vote on reunification. Let me take you back to the question that...
You're saying that the European Union...
I am going to insist on getting an answer to the question that I've asked.
Right, can't create a unification of Ireland.
Yeah.
Well, it can.
No, I haven't said that.
The only thing that can create a unification of Ireland...
No, let's have a conversation about things that have happened and been said, OK? So here is the problem, right?
Go on.
The Good Friday Agreement states that it is an agreement between two members of the European Union. That is in the text.
Yeah.
It isn't anymore. It's going to be an agreement between one member of the European Union...
Two sovereign states.
And another country. And it is...
Two sovereign states.
Yes, I just pay attention, mate, because I think you might be able to help me with this, because at the moment, you've come on and said, I've not understood it, but this is where I need your help. Because at the moment, it is absolutely inarguable that a requirement of the Good Friday Agreement is no difference in... just for the sake of trade. I mean, there's loads and loads of other stuff as well, but you have to obey if you're selling fish or you're selling milk or you're selling almost any other product. I think there might be some divergence on fuel, but you have to obey the same rules, right?
Yeah.
And now we are... No, you see, I haven't even begun to get close to finishing.
Go on.
So we are now, as Britain, saying we don't want to abide by those rules anymore. And the Good Friday Agreement says you have to abide by the same rules in both parts of Ireland. Just explain to me how that works. How can we abide by, as British people, different rules, while at the same time abiding by the same rules, Mark?
Well, the Good Friday Agreement is an international agreement. It's not a European Union agreement.
Just focus in. No, of course it isn't a European Union agreement. But just focus in on this question, okay? Just calm down, because I really think you can help me here.
I'm not. I'm just. Yeah, go on.
Thank you.
What is the question?
Well, I've asked it 3 times now. That's why I keep suggesting that you just pause and listen.
Let me answer then.
No, but you just asked me what the question is, Mark. You can't answer it unless we're clear.
The question that you're saying is how can you move products, move sales, move things?
No. That's not the question at all. The question is how can you simultaneously have different rules between the two territories and an agreement that insists that they abide by the same rules?
No. It doesn't insist that you abide by the same rules.
It really does.
Any agreement, any international agreement, right, is always flexible to change, right?
No, it really isn't. That's what a treaty is.
It really is. All international agreements, right, are subject
to
change.
Once more, I'm going to ask you again, because that's not true. I mean, the whole point about writing down...
It is true. It is. There's plenty of international agreements all over the world that have been changed and been flexible. Do you know what I mean? As time moves on, circumstances changes, institutions changes, governments changes. Right. You're bound to understand that.
Yeah, okay, let's pretend that's true. And now let's go back to the question. How do you have two territories that are bound by the requirements of an international treaty to operate under the same rules? How do you keep that treaty intact while having the two signatories to the treaty abiding by different rules, Mark?
Well, what you do is you get the two sides together and you have to have the compromise that made the Good Friday Agreement.
Right.
And a compromise...
So you have to change the Good Friday Agreement?
You don't have to... You can compromise it and you can...
But what do you mean when you say compromise? Do you mean change the Good Friday Agreement as it currently stands?
Not change the Good Friday Agreement fundamentally, but you can put in changes. The Good Friday
what change would you put in then?
It was always stated as a flexible agreement.
No, it really wasn't, though. But
oh, yes, it really was, because the consent of the people...
You can keep saying that, but you must answer my question at some point.
Underlines the Good Friday Agreement. Tony Blair wrote a card and put it on billboards around Belfast.
Yes, but that's the consent of the people of whether they want it or not, Mark, not whether or not they're going to change it. So you've just said you want to change it, but you don't want to change it.
No. The agreement, the Good Friday Agreement there has been changes through the Good Friday Agreement. For instance, the Good Friday Agreement was Good Friday Agreement, then became the Belfast Agreement. Right?
No, it's both. It's the Belfast Agreement. Its nickname is the Good Friday Agreement. That wasn't a change in the name.
Then had to go to St Andrews.
Mark, I'm going to have to, mate. I'm going to have to go. I honestly can't.
I'll tell you one thing, James. There'll never be United Ireland as long as I live.
But that's feelings, you see. And we began this whole conversation with me saying, as I understand the rules and the facts and the laws, this is happening. You said you've misunderstood it because you're talking about rules, facts and laws. I said it's all about feelings, and now you're just off on what, mate. You've got to listen. You've got to listen, because it doesn't matter how deeply you believe something. If you can't answer the question I've asked, you've wasted everybody's time. You can collect tariffs remotely if you know. I mean, smuggling would be an issue, but if you're shipping something from A to B and there's a tariff involved, you don't have to actually check it where A turns into B. You can check it at the port of entry. Similarly, there are technological solutions to some of the problems thrown up by the prospect of a hard Brexit, but I can't see how the Good Friday Agreement can survive the introduction of profoundly different regimes or environments on either side of what used to be the hard border in Ireland. And this isn't even a Brexit conversation. This is actually just a technical conversation. I mean, the last fella notwithstanding, it doesn't matter what your feelings are or even what your attitude to a potentially united Ireland is. This is a question about whether or not the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement can survive the hard Brexit that has looked, in the absence of calling the whole thing off, hard Brexit has looked inevitable for the best part of 18 months. Certainly a year. It's over a year since I said to you, I think it's a year almost to the day since I said to you, largely because of looking at the Irish issue, I do not see how this can end in any one of either no deal or no Brexit. I don't see how there can be a deal that accommodates the red lines and the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement and, you know, whatever other unicorn you were hoping would turn up today. And I still don't. And I don't have the... I don't have there's no dog in the fight here for me. I mean, I care because you don't want your neighbours and your friends and your fellow Brits or your Irish friends and family to suffer, but it just wanted explaining how you can do the two things. How can you have two separate sets of rules in place on an island that is bound by a treaty that insists both parties abide by the same rules? I mean, surely this is just something everyone can agree on. I think the Conservative Party membership are close to understanding it when a majority of them report that they would consider the collapse of the union to be a price worth paying for their Brexit. Oddly, I'm in agreement with that. I don't think it's a price worth paying, obviously. I don't think there's anything worth Brexiting for. I haven't been given one tangible benefit since June of 2016. But that's not the argument we're having today. The argument we're having today is, how can it possibly happen that you have a treaty that insists two parties abide by the same rules, to make it as simple as I can, but a Brexit that will take place precisely because one party wants to start abiding by different rules? Ray's in Galway. Ray, what would you like to say?
Mr. O'Brien, good morning.
Hello, Ray.
Hello to you. I was listening to your previous caller, and I think it demonstrates exactly how intractable the Irish problem is.
Well, for sure.
I really can't see a solution to this, and I would have been like many of my other friends over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, considering that the UK made a terrible mistake in leaving the union, but they did, and that's over and done with.
I mean, yeah, let's talk as if it is.
I don't think there's any going back on that.
Probably
much as
not.
Mr. Corbyn may like to. I think you're stuck with it now, and your two contending leaders for the premiership show that. In any event, to come back to the Irish difficulty, let's not call it the Irish problem. That sounds really 1940-ish.
Yes.
But I do personally, I've come to the belief that there is no other solution except to replace the border, because fundamentally we will be two different countries. Whether we like it or not, Northern Ireland will remain part of the United Kingdom for the long foreseeable future. I can't see how that will be any different. And if that's the case, Ireland will be part of the EU. Northern Ireland will remain part of the UK. And there really is no way, if animal transfers, if exports are to go through between two separate countries, there has to be checks, there has to be border controls, and there has to be customs controls. I cannot see any way out of this, and I was amused at your description of a unicorn solution.
Yes.
I think that's what they're talking about.
I don't know. I'm not quite as scorched earth as you. I mean, I couldn't tell you what it is, but I can conceive of... I mean, it can't be beyond the wit of man I mean, smuggling might be a price you pay in order to accommodate it, but it can't be beyond the wit of man in our lifetimes, Ray, to come up with a solution to this that involves, you know, variations on the magical thinking that we've heard, the technological solutions, but with a bit more research and evidence to support them.
Well, I think that was the very purpose of putting in the backstop, so that all of these technological advances that I'm sure will evolve over the course of time. I mean, that was the sensible solution that Mrs. May did produce, and I'm always disappointed when I hear that it's Mrs. May's agreement, because truly she must have had a pile of experts advising her every step of the way. I feel she's getting an unfair blame for her agreement, but that's a side issue.
Well, I mean, she couldn't have done this any differently, except for those red lines. Once she said those red lines are in place, we're coming out of the customs union and the single market. How could the Good Friday Agreement have been sustained? What was she expecting to happen?
I agree entirely with you, and I think this is a non-contentious conversation that we're having. I think.
Well, except it isn't, because half the country, or at least half the Conservative membership that are going to elect the next Prime Minister, they. No, but then I see what you mean. So this is the third way. So it just goes back to a hard border, and that explodes. Pardon the pun. That explodes the Good Friday.
I was listening to the new chief of the PSNI last night, and he was very interesting.
The police service of Northern Ireland.
I don't think he's from Northern Ireland. I got a feeling that he's from Great Britain.
Okay.
But he was very, very depressive about the fact that there may be hard borders, and I can understand why.
But then the Belfast Agreement ceases to exist, right?
I'm afraid something like that, because I mean, much and all as our Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, for whom I have a lot of admiration, and the people in Europe, you know, obviously we would admire the stance that they're taking, but I just cannot see how you can reconcile the irreconcilable. I don't know how you can have the rules and the laws that apply to the EU suddenly being kind of okay with the rules and the laws that apply to a separate United Kingdom.
And there's some areas of divergence, as people point out, on VAT, but not on the island of Ireland, in all the other areas, because if you wanted a different tax regime, you can't. If I'm going to open a factory, as I understand the Good Friday Agreement, there can't be anything that makes Northern Ireland more or less attractive than the Republic of Ireland.
Sure, yeah.
That's it, isn't it? It's a sort of commercial parity.
I think the difficulty, the principal difficulty, I think that we have, you can lock up the containers of manufactured goods, and you can have agreement between them that such and such a thing exists within the container, you know, in terms of manufactured goods.
Yes.
I think the real problem would be in the area of agriculture, where you have thousands and thousands of beef products exported.
And they'd have to be individually checked by vets time they crossed the border.
That's right, and I mean, they go across the border, as I understand it, and I'm no expert here, but my understanding is that beef goes across the border in some cases live, in some cases dissected, and then they're returned processed to Ireland, or vice versa. They're brought from it, and boy, oh boy, maintaining some kind of
that's
control.
why I think we're going to disagree then in parting, because that's why I think it's more likely, especially given what we've learnt about the Conservative Party in the last sort of month or so, I think it's more likely that de facto border will move to the sea. And so you'll have checks when the animals are brought in, and they'll throw the DUP under the bus.
Well, I was just about to say, try and persuade the DUP that that's going to be the case.
I don't have to persuade the DUP. I don't have to persuade the DUP. There's only 10 of them.
Well, that's true. The question is, can they get 10 Labour people over on their side?
Of course, and that's why there is almost certainly going to be a general election, I would have thought, before the end of the year. But again, I keep breaking the habit of a lifetime. I'm going to have to stop describing it as a habit of a lifetime. I was socialising with politicians last night of all hues, including some American senators. But the Conservative MP I was sitting next to put the likelihood of a general election before Christmas at 15%. And he was very, very bright and really nice, actually. I really enjoyed his company. I won't ruin his reputation by telling you his name. Working on the principle that if you're going to upset anybody, you might as well upset everybody. What an absolute shower in Strasbourg today. Not just the Muppets turning their back on. Imagine how we'd feel if people turned their back on our national anthem or something like that. But the Liberal Democrats have turned up with their T-shirts with that phrase containing the B word to describe testicles. It's just not appropriate. Obviously, in the sort of annals of ridiculous behaviour, these Absolute loonies turning their backs on Beethoven. Yeah, down with Beethoven. It is Beethoven, isn't it? I've probably embarrassed myself now. Oh, did you see the Beethoven or Cat Stevens? I always get them mixed up. But then the Liberal Democrats turn up in T-shirts with rude words on them. I quite like the slogan, testicles to Brexit, with the alliteration, obviously, but not in Parliament. Well, I suppose you take your silver linings where you can find them, but some of these new MEPs in Farage's mob are tweeting their surprise at things like discovering that the Strasbourg Parliament is in Strasbourg. It's actually quite... It's a sort of art form, I suppose, of thought. Speaking of art forms, Dmitry Grozobinski has turned Brexit commentary into something of an art form. He's a former Australian trade negotiator who now advises and trains on attendant issues, skills, trade policy, and the intersection where they meet. And I've asked him onto the programme today, partly because I like to think I played a part in discovering him, and I've sat idly by while all other LBC presenters have availed themselves of his expertise, but I've never had the opportunity to talk to him. But mainly because you've been commenting on Jeremy Hunt's promise of subsidies for agriculture and fishing, Dimitri, and if I've understood your commentary correctly, it may not be quite as straightforward as Jeremy Hunt apparently thinks.
Hey, James, it's really good to be with you. And yeah, look, absolutely, to the extent that I've been discovered and 6 people worldwide might know how to incorrectly pronounce my name, it's all on you. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, like everything else in trade that everybody is waking up to, this is a lot more complicated than it sounds. When countries agreed to put limits on their tariffs, they kind of thought one step ahead and said, hold on, if we say our tariffs can't go above this number, what happens if other countries just pile on subsidies to get over that tariff? So we tariff something at 50%, and then the government of the exporter just gives them 50% of the value of their product. Our tariffs would do nothing.
Yes.
That's no good. So they definitely kind of thought this step through, and so they banned certain kind of subsidies and put limits on others. The principal issue that I had with Mr. Hunt's announcement was that it sounded like he was considering giving subsidies specifically to the farmers and fisherwomen who export to the EU or who previously exported to the EU.
Right.
Now, I mean, this is like a one line in one tweet, so it's really hard to do like policy analysis of what is essentially a throwaway line, but you definitely can't do that. That is one thing you are explicitly not allowed to do. You're not allowed to give someone a subsidy based on whether they export. You're allowed to give, there's an extent to which you can give agricultural subsidies. You can say, listen, we're going to support lamb producers, irrespective of whether they exported to the EU or not, which is simply going to provide some support to the lamb sector. The problem there, of course, James, is that because you can't discriminate between them, if you've got $3 billion to divide among lamb producers, you're going to be giving a lot of it to lamb producers who don't export. Or who didn't previously export.
And the money is designed, Hunt's money is designed to plug a hole that might be left by leaving the European Union. So you'd end up...
Well, this is the weird thing. I mean, how do you plug a hole with no visible edge? And Jeremy Hunt's announcement left a lot of these questions out there. So let's say there's no deal and the EU is then automatically imposes these tariffs. If this money is supposed to just bridge the gap for 1 or 2 years until that access comes back, which is far from guaranteed, by the way.
Yes.
But if that's the plan, then it kind of makes sense.
Okay.
If it's just this kind of thing of, we'll just keep giving them money because they don't have access to the EU now until things get better in some unspecified way, then that makes much, much less sense.
Oh, Lord.
And there's certainly no way for a farmer to live.
No, so, I mean, you probably won't comment on this, but it seems to be more like an easily digestible soundbite than a carefully thought-out policy.
Well, I have no idea what went into it. Let me say flat out, look, I think it's a good thing that instead of now talking about no deal as if it has no negative consequences whatsoever,
yes.
which is what people were doing, I want to say a year ago, but I feel like about 40 minutes ago, at least one of the candidates in this race has now gone on record to go, hey, listen, this is going to punch a whole bunch of UK businesses right in the...
Well, you're right, but he's going to crack on with a heavy heart. He's going to do it. I mean, you've seen the other line, the businesses are going to go bankrupt, but it has to happen, and he'll do it with a heavy heart. Just again, to clarify, because you mentioned agriculture, I mean, if we were to rewind 3 years and a month, and if someone were to say leaving the European Union is going to involve damage to our fishing industry that will have to be bailed out with government money, I mean, that's almost too surreal to contemplate. It was pretty quickly the only reason left for doing it was to help our fishing industry. So, again, the confusion increases the more you contemplate the issue.
Yeah, and look, I think nothing makes more sense than making a policy change that fundamentally affects 64 million people based on an incorrect understanding of what it'll mean for 10,000 fisherfolk across the UK.
Yes.
But look, a lot of people voted for Brexit for lots of different reasons,
Absolutely.
and I think I personally always do take issue with the Remain campaign,
yes.
because it feels like a lot of them are discovering this stuff for the first time in 2019.
Yeah, because these arguments could have been brought to the battle before the vote was cast, rather than 2 or 3 years later.
Yeah, and look, I know people in the Remain campaign take issue with me when I say this, but my view from the sidelines was there was a huge reliance on these giant economy-wide macro figures of, this will have a negative 2% of GDP or something over 15 years, which my personal theory has never convinced anyone of anything in the history of human civilization.
It's too big and too nebulous.
Impact of what does this mean for a lamb farmer in Wales?
Yeah,
what does it mean to her community?
I remember that when those stories first started coming out about the hill farmers in Wales and the damage that would be potentially done to them by no deal, and it did. You're quite right. It did feel a little bit too little, too late. Moving on, if we may, I've been desperately trying to get Brandon Lewis onto the programme to explain why 6 months ago it was announced that we'd be rolling over some of our trade agreements with Switzerland. And he described this as both positive and news on social media at the weekend. Very oddly, I don't know whether there's something wrong with his phone, but we can't seem to raise him or any of his myriad aides and attendants. My analysis was that it definitely wasn't news because it was announced 6 months ago. But I think, and I'm very amateurish compared to you, digging into things yesterday, this rolling over excludes services. So what's your understanding of what we've rolled over in our trading agreements with Switzerland?
Look, let me begin by saying that anybody who really wants to get into the weeds of this should read Peter Ungverkorn's Trade Better blog, where he goes into this in minute detail.
I'll provide a link to that from my Twitter account later in the programme.
Fantastic. But very, 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 very high level, what the UK-Swiss agreement did was it's basically divided into two parts. The first one says this is what we'll do if there is a deal between the UK and the EU, which is basically they're going to keep things exactly the same as they are now during the transition, and that's it. And then during that transition, they will try to figure out the next step. But then they created a whole separate part of it which said, what are we going to do if there's no deal? And that is far, far more limited. As you said, it completely doesn't include services. But
that's 16-point-something billion pounds.
Right, which doesn't necessarily mean it's
won't all
get
disappear.
Too excited about some figures.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that it all disappears. What agreements on services tend to do is a lot of the time they're kind of locking in the regulation a country already has. So it's important people don't think, okay, this doesn't have a services component. That means 100% of the services sales the UK currently makes to Switzerland end abruptly. There will almost certainly be some disruption, and there's additional access Switzerland provides to the UK that it doesn't provide to, say, Venezuela.
Yes.
That will lose, but it's not going to be 100%, but it is a significant chunk.
And we'll have to wait and see.
And for the UK, which is like the world's first, heading to be the world's first major economy that exports more services than goods, which is incredible.
Yes.
it's a significant blow because it's basically a big to be discussed.
So when the chairman of the Conservative Party describes it as positive news, he's just wrong.
Better than not having the agreement. I mean, it is better than... So the goods component...
So a bad deal is better than no deal, to put it into sound bites.
An incomplete deal is better than no deal because at least it covers something.
And it's demonstrably and considerably worse than what we currently have.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, you can't replicate the single market through FTAs. You just can't. It's not ever going to happen for you. Switzerland is probably one of the more... They're going to be the more generous with the UK compared to a lot of other countries because they're integrated into the EU and they're integrated quite a bit. They have supply chains that overlap with the UK in a way that, say, Canada doesn't. So they're more inclined to be generous than others. But even they have limits on what they're willing to do, even with their EU partners, let alone with the UK, which is going to be a third party.
You can find out more about Dimitri and his work at his website, explaintrade.com, or you can follow him on Twitter, Dimitri Opines. That's where I discovered him, Dimitri Grozobinski. Many thanks indeed. Brandon Lewis, paging Brandon Lewis, chairman of the Conservative Party, passing off this weekend something that will massively and inevitably reduce our trading status with Switzerland as positive news. I can't get hold of him for love nor money. I have to start calling in favours from my new Conservative MP friends. It's 11:01. Turn your back on some music because you disapprove of the institution in which you found yourself. Shouldn't you turn your back on the salary? And the expenses and the perks. I mean, you don't actually have to turn up. Did anybody tell them this? These so-called Brexit Party MEPs. They don't have to go. I mean, what better way to register their displeasure than to refuse to take the money that they claim is sort of somehow tainted? And just standing up in a parliament and turning your back upon music while filling your pockets. Looking into the background of some of these people, this is by far the best paid job they've ever had. Surely that would be a lot more impressive. If you wanted to talk about integrity, even I would admire that. You know, I could take 70 grand a year out of this place, but I'm not going to. I don't know. Or maybe you think that turning your back on some music is really powerful. 6 minutes after 11. A couple more calls on this Northern Ireland question, because I just think, again, I stress it's not to debate this. It's an ask, an attempt at an explanation from me, and then simply a kind of plea for correction or critiquing. It can't sustain. It just can't. You cannot have simultaneously a treaty that demands an entire island abides by the same rules and regulations in many, many areas, and a post-Brexit reality whereby part of that island makes up a whole set of new rules and regulations that will be deliberately and demonstrably different from the rules and regulations that were in place before, while the rules and regulations that were in place before continue to apply to the other part of the same island. And that's just and I know facts get on some people's nerves. I'll never forget the first time at work, so someone rang in and had a go at me for using facts. And I should have probably seen the writing on the wall back then. You can prove anything with facts, James. And I sort of thought, well, yeah, of course you can. So maybe I've missed the facts here. Maybe I see it. My man in Galway, Ray, sees it as inevitable that a hard border will be reintroduced. I could go along with that in the short term, but I think in the long term it's a lot more likely that Ireland will be united in our lifetime, possibly even sooner than anyone dare think, because if we've learned anything from the last 3 years, it's about how stuff we've taken for granted all our lives can be torn up and thrown out the window, for good or for ill, in the blink of an eye. Stuff that we thought would be there forever can disappear, like our status in the world or our reputation as being serious people. Sarah's in Belfast. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I'm calling as a first-time caller, so I'm exceptionally nervous.
You're very welcome. There's nothing to be nervous about.
Thank you. But I felt that I had to pick up the phone this morning because of people like me who live very ordinary lives in Northern Ireland, who go to work, who bring up our families, who pay our taxes. If we are talking about reunification as the only way out of this Brexit mess,
really,
then yes, absolutely. Then Dublin and London for a very long time, and I would say both Dublin and London, who thought that they had resolved the issue with the Good Friday Agreement, and indeed they had, then it's a very, very serious situation. We feel as if we wake up every morning in what is the nightmare of the social experiment of the Brexit mess.
You're the guinea pigs.
Yeah, absolutely. We feel as if we are we feel as if we're the test tube.
Yes,
we're in the test tube, and we feel as if the DUP, we people from both unionist and nationalist backgrounds in Northern Ireland look at the DUP and wonder why they've engaged in recreational Britishness, for the day.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to pry unduly, but how, when you have these conversations with your friends and neighbours and colleagues, and a consensus emerges that reunification or unification is the only way to address some of the problems we've been discussing today, are they from both sides of the historical divides?
Absolutely.
Seriously?
Absolutely.
So you've got unionists now who would put the union with Europe ahead of the union with the United Kingdom, and the only way that they can achieve that is by uniting with Ireland. So two unions.
Yeah, and it's absolutely coming from, and it's coming from an economic perspective. It's coming from a travel perspective. We were launched into the nightmare of a few months ago, thinking that we were going into, leaving the European Union in March time. We had to apply, for a green card to cross the border. In terms of keeping our insurance, we had to apply for, different driving licenses if we wanted to travel abroad, and we have them sitting here. That is the reality of this. That is the reality of living in such a small community and thinking that we're going to be part, of one country, but not part of the European Union. And essentially people are now thinking, we never thought, this is the thing, James, we thought the Good Friday Agreement would, carry us through. It would be a transitional period. Somewhere along the line that, a border pull would happen. And, eventually people would peacefully go down the road of reunification. Brexit has brought this forward now. It has fast forwarded us into actually having the conversation. We're actually having a conversation.
I was in the Republic a month ago, and I had the conversation several times with people. But again, you wonder as a Brit, you wonder whether you're misunderstanding the issue or whether you're being exposed to an unrepresentative. Obviously, I was doing some events for my book, so the crowd was quite heavily Remain, so I didn't necessarily know whether I was meeting a cross-section of people. If I was to speak to a Belfast resident who is in favour of Brexit, what would they think was going to happen next? Do you know?
It's aligned very much with their Britishness and how they feel.
So it's feelings then, isn't it? Like the fellow we had on earlier who really objected to the citing of regulations and facts.
Yeah, that's essentially why I phoned, because, he said that we're all thinking the same thing. We're very much not thinking the same thing.
No,
I mean, the business community and in agriculture and finance are waking up each day and are aghast. And thinking, why are you doing this? And then you tie it in with the emotion of what has happened, in this country, for the last 20 or 30 and 40 years. And you think, well, one, we don't want to go back to that, but we don't want to go back to economic troubles.
Yeah. Is it a given that the South would vote yes in a border poll?
I think so.
Because that would really, talk about a chaos if they actually, because there's an economic cost to the Republic of Ireland involved in unification. But that might be an area where feelings trump economics, actually, from the other side of the coin, so to speak.
We're very well aware in Northern Ireland how sometimes Dublin regard us and how they feel about us, and we're literally caught in the middle. But we really feel at the minute like we're like a toddler being led around by an adult who doesn't know where they're going.
Well, I mean, that's how we feel here. But of course, I mean, not arguably, you're going to be exposed to more of the potential damage, and in a way that no one in Great Britain is going to be exposed to it, because there's going to be disruption. There might be chaos. It's a question of how bad things will be. They might not be as bad as the worst predictions. They might not. They probably won't be as good as the least bad predictions. But there's something about the fabric of your island that is under threat here. It feels to me.
Yeah, I mean, and that we feel that, and you cannot separate fact from feelings, and we very much feel like everything is under threat at the moment. But for the first time ever, I suppose, it has galvanised two separate communities together, and coming together, under economic terms, and saying, we've had enough of people being killed in Northern Ireland, and we got away from that. It was a very hard fought peace. But we do not want to go into economic troubles, and that's where we're going. And we have exceptional business people over here who have, for the last 2 to 3 years, been crying and literally saying, why are you not listening to us? And, and it's been ignored. I have to say now, Dublin very much have, fought to keep essentially skin in the game. And because they see the economic hardship that it's going to bring to both sides of Northern Ireland and the South. But, that we're now in the place where we're being told by people that they voted for economic hardship. They voted to be poorer. They voted to make businesses go bankrupt. So we're not that far behind you. Thank you. That was a brilliant debut, Sarah. I hope you'll call me again one day. It's 15 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to take a couple more calls on this. I want to find not a dissenting voice, because I stress again, this is not a morning. You know me, I enjoy a scrap rather more than the next man, but this isn't a morning for a scrap. This is just a morning for just trying to work out whether things could shake down any differently. And I'm thinking out loud. I'm not stressing or thumping the tub. I just can't see how you can have the things that we've described as a set of rules that applies equally across an island, and simultaneously a set of rules that only applies to part of it. Rules that are at odds with the rules that the rest of the island is abiding by. And if you've listened to people like Rees-Mogg or Mark Francois or Brexit hard man Steve Baker, and you've sort of thought they sounded plausible or they sounded like they made sense, it's them you need to ask now. And the question I'd begin with would really, really be this. If it's easy to solve this problem, why have you actually halted Brexit? Why did you actually vote to stop Brexit? Because you hated the backstop so much. The backstop is only there until the problem you say is easy to solve has been solved. This isn't even rhetoric from me. This is logic. Surely if it's easy, then it doesn't matter that we've got something in place until the easy thing is fixed. I keep coming back to some of these observations, thinking maybe you got it wrong the first time, or maybe you misunderstood something, but there's nothing simpler than that. They say it's easy. They also say they will furiously resist any attempt to keep things as they are until the easy thing is done. Which, of course, if you've got a brain in your head, makes you go, well, maybe it's not that easy. And as soon as you start looking into the question of whether it is easy or not, well, phone-ins like this happen. So if no deal Brexit goes ahead, which I probably put at 65% likelihood now, possibly even 70, how does the Good Friday Agreement survive? Answer from pretty much every caller we've had, it can't, including the caller who was cross, who said we'd have to change it or compromise. I don't want to misrepresent him. I don't think you can. I think that the nature of an international peace treaty is such that it's sacrosanct, so to speak. And if that goes down, then what happens to Ireland? Answer, either the border moves to the sea and it becomes a de facto united island operating under customs union and single market rules, separate from the rest of the United Kingdom, in which case the DUP have a cow, and the Scottish nationalists also have an enormously powerful weapon with which to plead their case. Or you put a hard border in place, which absolutely nobody wants, but could be rendered inevitable by what we've done, or the island actually unites not just de facto, but facto, completely.
Or is there an alternative that we've missed? John's in Edinburgh. John, what do you think?
I think there might be an obvious alternative, and that's actually not to leave the EU, but that's far too fast.
You cheeky beggar.
To think that way. I mean, it smacks of a certain amount of hypocrisy. I mean, I'm an Irishman living in Edinburgh.
Yes.
And we find a hypocrisy here when one looks at it. It's amazing, because you can't be different to the north of Ireland. Okay, you cannot possibly enter into the idea that you might have a different trading than the rest of the UK when trading with the EU, okay? But yet, you can do that in Jersey and in all of the other places which are sort of coming out of the EU as well.
You mean there's sort of tax havens?
Lots of things.
So why could... I don't think I'm going to argue with you, am I? It does seem hypocritical, but I mean, are you suggesting we turn Northern Ireland into a tax haven?
Well, you didn't necessarily turn into a tax haven, but the idea that I think one of the problems in this particular situation is that the Good Friday Agreement was negotiated by some pretty serious people.
Yeah.
They really...
I miss serious people, John. I really miss the serious people.
And we could do with some serious people. I think the world will probably turn around to Britain right now and say, look, lads, why don't you come back to the table when you've got some serious people in charge?
Did the serious people ever turn their back on music?
On music.
Did they ever tell you you've not been following events in Strasbourg today?
I'm an Irishman. I'm a very proud Irishman. I live in Edinburgh. I would go to dinners over the years, and when God Save the Queen was sang, I would I'd not sing it. No. Because it's not my national anthem, but I would be respectful. I would stand, and I would be respectful to people around me.
In someone else's house.
I can't think of what if I turn my back on a table. Oh, my God's sake.
It takes all sorts. What then? I like this angle because you are well placed to make it the Scottish response to any form of dispensation. So the Northern Ireland idea that it becomes part of the Irish market and therefore the single market and not the British market makes sense on paper. The DUP would go nuts, but the DUP are always going nuts about something. But your big problem with it is that Scotland which also voted Remain and it also stands to suffer from a no-deal Brexit, would turn around and go, whoa.
Well, hold on. No, it wouldn't necessarily result in independence, although one could see that happening. But it wouldn't necessarily. But it would be necessary for a British government, a Westminster government, to say, okay, Northern Ireland, you're a particular situation here. We can see the sense of giving you a particular position here. Yeah, we know we're going to muck around it. The DUP are going to fall out with this, but so what? Let's just do it.
Yes.
I think if you do that, then the Scots would come to the table and say, okay, you do. So we're glad you've seen sense here. We're glad you're turning to more serious people. We never thought it would happen.
Right.
But in order for us to be accommodated by being, even to be a member of the single market, okay,
yeah, of course,
we have to control the levers of power and tax and various things in Scotland. Now, this is sort of what Devo Max, to a certain extent, what was promised at the time of in 2014. It would be Devo Max. But in order to do that, you've got to hand all these powers over to a Scottish Parliament, okay? And then you hit the nub of the situation. The nub of the situation is there is a huge amount of natural wealth in Scotland. And there is no great, huge amount of natural wealth in the north of Ireland. And Westminster is saying, hold on here, that will disappear off our asset sheet. We're really unhappy about that.
No, I hear you. What do you think is going to happen if there is no deal, which I think most of us would say above 50% chance now?
I think there is a fair probability that they will split up the UK.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Who'd have thought that getting our country back meant chopping it in half?
I think if you had some serious politicians from Britain at the table, but serious ones,
yes,
they would have never gone for this nonsense of a Brexit vote in any event.
Yes.
Okay? And the problem is, I mean, people are saying things like, is Boris the British version of Donald Trump? And I think the more you look at it, in actual fact, Boris and even Jeremy Hunt, they're more like Ivanka Trump.
I might. If you hear me
standing there on the sidelines of serious people, and they're sort of trying to get into the conversation.
Except it's as if Ivanka Trump had her own show as well. So in real life, she's standing in on the sidelines, trying to join in with Christine Lagarde and Merkel and May and Macron. But then she has her own, which is the only thing that British people see is the spin-off show, the Johnson and Jeremy spin-off show. We never actually see the main series that it's a spin-off from, where all the real stuff is happening. We only see the spin-off show, and we're back in.
I think we've been groomed for years and years and years. I mean, this is not. I've been living here for 42 years, and I can see this grooming going on all of the time. It happens.
Well, I mean, yes,
in all sorts of facets of life.
Because how else do you get people? You know, I don't know if you were listening yesterday. We had a fella on yesterday claiming that Brexit was going to be good for his business that he worked for, and he made the mistake of naming the business.
Yeah.
So he rang his boss. So what do you think about no-deal Brexit? He said it will be absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah.
And that's what you mean by grooming, because that poor fella yesterday, the lad in Dewsbury, banging on about cashless technologies and how his business is at the forefront of this and forefront, refused to answer the question of what can't you do now that you will be able to do come November, but kept insisting that this was a sector that would benefit. So we rang the boss. And the phrase he used was absolutely catastrophic. That's what John means by grooming. How do you end up believing something that isn't true? It's an unpleasant phrase. It's a very unpleasant verb, but it essentially involves persuading people that really, really bad stuff is normal and or good. That's what grooming means. 28 minutes after 11 is the time. Shall I squeeze in Maria, or would we be pushing things a little bit too tightly? I'll squeeze you in, Maria. I can only give you a minute. Make it brilliant.
Well, it won't be brilliant, James. Good morning. I agree with Sarah 100%. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat this morning.
That's all right.
I also agree with your previous caller. It's a nonsense.
Yes.
But I also agree with Michael Portillo, strangely enough,
Go on.
when he said that Boris Johnson, in the event of a no deal, would go straight back to the European Union and say, Northern Ireland only backstop. Let's go.
So he'll throw the DUP under a bus?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, well, the only thing you can say with any confidence about Boris Johnson is that he would throw anybody under a bus, including his own grandmother, if he thought it would advance his own cause, even in the short term. Just for the avoidance of that was metaphorical about throwing his grandmother over a bus, just in case Nigel's thinking of phoning the police.
I think any of the Tories would throw the DUP under the bus, especially after the polls a week or so ago.
Yeah, where the membership would cheer them all the way as they did so. So you think the most likely outcome is Johnson...
Northern Ireland, borderline the Irish Sea, Northern Ireland only backstop.
And then Northern Ireland in its current form ceases to exist, really, because it will be much more closely aligned with the Republic of Ireland than it is with the United Kingdom.
Well, of course, we'd sort of pussyfoot around it for quite a while.
Yeah, of course we would.
People got used to it. I think that's going to happen.
I think it is as well. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the arithmetic and the majorities in Parliament, of course, but I suspect, what a beautiful way to close this entire conversation, bang on time as well. I suspect Marie's analysis is the closest to what is actually going to happen. And John's, of course, they tally with each other. It's 11:30.